Hey, Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Thanks so much for being here. This week's special Recount 2000, Bush v. Gore. Look at those two young lads right there. My favorite 2000 fact is that if Al Gore won his home state of Tennessee, then he would have won the election. He lost his home state. Anyway, there's other relevant things we're going to talk about. We're going to get the inside story of what happened during that whole episode. We'll talk about the legal precedent that the Supreme Court case set, and we are going to see that again, I promise you, in the next few days and weeks here. And then we're also going to talk to one of our favorite historians about how there's nothing new under the sun. Election turmoil is nothing new. We always think we're so special. There's been lots of election chaos in the past, and I think that perspective will bring us peace as everyone else is running around with their hair on fire. Quick update on the moment that we're in right now before we go and reflect on the past. So the media has three reactions to the whole situation right now we're in right now with the election. First is they ignore it, right? And that's 98% of what they do. They just ignore everything. Second reaction is they ridicule. And then the third is they call you a racist. So they'll ignore and have ignored and will continue to ignore as much as they possibly can. That's 98% of their strategy, is to ignore everything. The 2% remaining is, the 2% that they do mention, is only there to ridicule you, right? Example of that would be the talking point that Trump has lost 25 lawsuits, or whatever number that they use any given day. And they don't give you the truth of that. Right? So they'll bring up the lawsuits, but only to ridicule you. Oh, Trump lost them all. He's 0 for 25, you stupid idiots. But they don't tell the truth. They don't say that those lawsuits were brought by individual people or groups not associated with Trump. Those aren't Trump lawsuits. It would be like if I, as a conservative, filed a lawsuit about the election and my lawsuit got thrown out because I don't have standing or something, which means that I can't prove that I was harmed by the situation. So I lose, I get it tossed out, and then the media says, oh, Trump lost a lawsuit. It's like, no, Trump didn't lose the lawsuit. Rudy said that Trump's team has only filed 3 lawsuits, and 2 of them are ongoing, and one of them they stopped themselves because it dealt with the Wayne County, which is Detroit, results, and the Board of Election people did not certify the votes on their own, so they didn't need the lawsuit anymore, so they pulled it themselves. But that's an example of just that 2% of coverage. It's there only to laugh at you and make fun of Rudy sweating during the press conference. Right? They're very serious journalists, you know. And then the third thing they do, and this is sprinkled on top of everything, is to just call you a racist. Call everything and everyone a racist, who dare even ask a completely legitimate question of, hey, it seems like there's more votes here than voters. What's that about? Oh, you're disenfranchising black people, you hate black people, you racist, blah, blah, blah. We saw that in action the other day. We played a clip from what happened in Michigan. Let me share one interesting accusation from the Trump team. And again, if we had an honest media, decent media, a moderately curious and fair media, then they would talk about this, but they don't. This is a very, this is not a fringe point here. And if Trump's team can prove this, I think this is one of the stronger arguments that Trump's team has in order to maybe even overturn a state. Here's Rudy.
There are 60,000 ballots in Milwaukee County and 40,000 ballots in Madison that, as far as we can tell, and this is why we're auditing, because we have very good information, the numbers are going to come out about here, that don't have applications. Under the law of the state of Wisconsin, already decided, if there's no application for an absentee ballot, the absentee ballot is thrown away. This all happened in 2 places in Wisconsin. Didn't happen in northern Wisconsin. Didn't happen in Republican Wisconsin. Didn't happen in neutral Wisconsin, where there are an equal number of Republicans and Democrats. It happened in a place where the vote was 75, 80% for the Democrat. You take away any number of those, and that 20,000 lead disappears. In other words, if you count the lawful votes, Trump won Wisconsin.
There was a Supreme Court case in Wisconsin in the spring, and the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that a local county clerk in Madison went beyond their authority with a declaration they made that went beyond the letter of the law. And they ruled unanimously against the Democrat county clerk. It was just a couple months ago. That alone, that right there sets a precedent in Wisconsin that the letter of the law, the letter of election law must be followed. So here's Rudy. I mean, we'll see again in court how they exactly word this, but here's Rudy saying, hey, here's 100,000 ballots. Again, Biden's up by about 20,000. Here's 100,000 ballots from people who cast an absentee who don't have an application for the absentee. So this is a completely legitimate, like if I was a Democrat, I'd want to know about this. Like, oh, are those going to be thrown out? We talked before about this 1994 New York Times article. And let me quote a little bit of this here. Saying the Democrats' election system has collapsed under a, quote, massive scheme, keep that word in mind, by Democrats to steal, this is New York Times, to steal a state Senate election in November. A federal judge today took the rare step of invalidating the vote in order that the seat be filled by the Republican nominee. An elaborate fraud in which hundreds, all right, we're talking hundreds of thousands. But in this case, in 1994, the quaint days of 26 years ago, it was hundreds of residents were encouraged to vote by absentee ballot, even though they had no legal reason to do so. In many instances, according to Republicans who testified, Democrat campaign workers forged absentee ballots. On many of the ballots, they used the names of people who were living in Puerto Rico or serving time in prison. And in one case, the voter had been dead for some time. Here's the quote from the judge. Substantial evidence was presented establishing massive absentee ballot fraud, deception, intimidation, harassment, and forgery. And even there are two Democrats on the board of elections, and they testified that they were aware of the voter fraud. This is one thing that no Democrat is going to admit to today, right? They were aware of the voter fraud. They intentionally failed to enforce it, and they tried to conceal their activities by hurriedly certifying the Democrat candidate as the winner. Okay, I share that because that was nothing compared to what happened a few weeks ago. And that judge said, hey, here's some absentee ballots that are fraudulent. Therefore, we're throwing all of them out. We're throwing all the absentee ballots out. And we're only going to count who voted in person that day, on election day. So can Trump's team prove that these ballots, we'll just focus on those ones in Wisconsin, that those ballots did not follow the letter of the law, should be thrown away, as happened in Pennsylvania in 1994, and also in Alabama in 86 and Louisiana sometime in the 70s. So there's precedent for this. Throw all those ballots away, and then Trump wins Wisconsin. We see the precedent, and then there's another precedent in Bush v. Gore, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, about the equal protection. I share that because we're not going to ignore this. We're not going to ridicule it. And friendly reminder, you are certainly not a racist for asking basic questions like this. As our friend Inez Stepman said, the Democrats contested Trump's legitimacy as president for 4 years. I'll give Trump until December 14th to press his claim in court. And if he doesn't have the goods, he doesn't. But I'm not going to tell him to stop trying because of norms from the folks who spent 3 of the 4 years on Russiagate and impeachment. We'll give him until December 14th. And I'll tell you, I am ready and anxious to see that royal flush from the president's team. At the very least, all these Republicans who run these state houses, they better get it together and change how we do elections to make sure that this never happens again. Election 2020, Bush v. Gore. We're going to talk next with someone who was there on Bush's team 20 years ago. But first, hackers. Hackers are good, right? We see what hackers can hack into. Some of the biggest companies in the world get hacked into all the time. And these companies have the strongest protections that money can buy, and it's still not enough. So if they can get into Twitter, if they can hack, if hackers can, if a 17-year-old can hack into Twitter, then of course hackers can get into your county registrar's office. And here's what they do. They steal the deed to your house. And then they forge a quit claim deed and start taking out loans against your home until all your equity's gone. And you have no idea this is happening. No one at the county is going to tell you because they think you're doing it. And now you're responsible for the bills. And you're responsible for the lawsuit afterwards. That may be even worse. Enter home title lock. So you can put some real guard dogs in charge of monitoring your home title. So if someone does anything with it, then you are notified immediately and you can put the kibosh on it right there. If it then goes to court, home title lock will cover you up to $500,000 in lawyer's fees, and they have an entire fraud team to help fight for you, which saves you just an infinite amount of hassle and headache. Have you ever been to court before? So that's home title lock. It's just part of the deal. If you own a house, it's part of it, right? They take this hassle off your plate forever. You got nothing to worry about. HomeTitleLock.com, and you can register your address, and you can see if you're already a victim, and use the code RADIO for 30 days of free protection. HomeTitleLock.com. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to our special Recount 2000 Bush v. Gore, where we're going to get the true story of what happened then and then find any relevance and precedent to what's happening right now as we speak. Well, let's talk to a man who was there, who was on the ground in the midst of all of this. Rob Henneke, he right now is the general counsel at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Rob, how are you, sir?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Good to talk to you. So where was your role back in 2000?
20 years goes quick. 20 years ago, I was a staff member of the Bush-Cheney campaign. I was an advance rep. I was a low-level staff member. Was in the Austin election headquarters at 301 Congress, and remember very vividly election night being downtown in Austin when Florida and other states started going back and forth, and we realized the election would not be resolved that night. And 37 days later, the fight ended with the Supreme Court's decision that made President George W. Bush the winner.
What do we need to know about that night? Take us to that night, anything that's interesting or relevant.
So I think it was, just the unprecedented nature 20 years ago of this, that everyone was there until 2 a.m. outside in the freezing drizzle in Austin until Chairman Evans came out finally around 2 a.m. and told the crowd, look, we're just not going to know tonight. Everybody needs to go home. And this is after the media had called Florida for Al Gore, and then they'd withdrawn that, and then they called Florida for George W. Bush, and then they'd withdrawn that. And it was obvious it was razor thin, and also, uncertainty as to what was going on. I remember going back to the office after the outside event closed and being outside of Karl Rove's office, where he called the Florida Secretary of State at like 2 or 3 in the morning and woke her up and said, well, what's going on in Florida? And she had no idea. She'd gone to bed assuming that then Governor Bush had won. So we immediately started deploying staff, telling staff, hey, go home, pack a suitcase, head to the airport. We'll have a plane ticket for you when you get there, because it wasn't just Florida. We didn't know if New Mexico and Ohio were also going to be in play, and so it was just everything was being done on the fly with very limited information.
So Trump's team today, depending on your perspective, is somewhere between reluctant or resilient on what happened a couple weeks back. What was Bush's team like back then? Were they like, oh, we probably lost, maybe we should concede? Or was it like a knockdown, drag out, tooth and nail fight, we're going to win this thing?
Well, it was the mindset of the campaign was that President Bush won, and that the team was going to Florida to defend that win from being taken away by the Democrats and by an attempt to change the voting process in Florida. Remember all of the fights over dimpled chads and hanging chads and punctured chads, where this recount threatened to change what the voters had decided on election night. I think a big difference was twofold. One, that effort in 2000 was focused in one state, and it was a massive effort, but it was still just one state. Here we've got Pennsylvania, Florida, Nevada, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, that all have legal contests that are going on. I think the other big difference is that there was cooperation in the process. I mean, I think the media realized on election night that they made a mistake. And so they pulled back. They reported on all the back and forth of Bush v. Gore, but they let the process work itself out for 37 days. They they respected the need to have, trust in the final outcome. And you also had cooperation among the local election officials that fully allowed the Bush team, the Gore team to participate in the process, not like what you see here today where, poll workers are being isolated from the counting, or they're boarding up windows so nobody can see what's going on inside, or, some of these, issues that have risen, kind of question the fairness of what's happening. And I don't remember that being an issue 20 years ago.
Yeah. Guys, that's such a good point, because let's say Biden ends up winning. The media, the way they've handled this by either completely ignoring or mocking and ridiculing anyone with any legitimate questions, is not helping anyone's trust in the outcome, and then therefore buy-in for the next 4 years. And then that's going to have ripple effects going down the road for the next few elections. That's such a really good point. What were some of the? So I think of it being two battles having to be waged back in 2000 and today till. You have like the public perception media narrative to fight, and then you have like the actual legal, how are we counting these votes? So how did Bush's team handle both of those? Maybe we can start with the narrative.
Well, I think on the narrative, again, it was all focused in, and I think you had a lot more neutrality in the reporting. In here's what's happened, here's the day's events, here's the perspective of the Bush team, here's the perspective of the Gore team, and I think the public could have a better sense without really feeling that the media was on one side or another. So it was daily reporting. It went back and forth for 37 days, but I think the public felt like they were accurately informed on that. In terms of the legal issues, one of the big issues then, which was important to the U.S. Supreme Court in Bush v. Gore, which is also at play here today, has been the problems that have arisen from some of these election administrators going outside of the state law for their state. This has come into play in Pennsylvania with the Philadelphia wanting to count absentee ballots after Election Day, or waiving the signature requirements or whatnot. Well, other counties in Pennsylvania didn't do that. And so what was discussed by the court in 2000 and what is being argued here today is that you've created a constitutional problem through the equal protection, through the unequal way that two counties in the same state are counting votes. And so that is disenfranchising potentially votes that were cast according to state law when you have the next door county that's counting votes in the same election under a different process. And that potentially...
And that was in Florida? That was a problem in Florida too, that argument?
Well, that was because then that was in play in Miami-Dade and Broward County and whatnot when, you were talking about how to count the punch cards. Does a punctured chad count, or does it have to be, fully cut loose? What if it's, an imprint? And so part of how those counties were wanting to interpret ballots to decide which votes to count or whatnot was arguably creating a constitutional problem because that was not a consistent standard in the state. And we're certainly seeing a lot of inconsistency in the states right now that are currently being litigated.
Wow, so it's an equal protection problem? Is that the constitutional term that's relevant?
It is.
Wow,
citizens are afforded equal treatment under law. And if you and I both live in the same state, you and I should both vote and participate in the election process in the same way to make sure that your vote counts just as much as my vote.
Yeah, wow, so that could come up. Interesting. All right, I want to ask you about the Supreme Court too. We'll get back to that. But what would you say you're hearing people talk about Bush v. Gore and it's being thrown up and you were on the ground. What's people's biggest misperception of the whole thing, the whole experience, or maybe specifically the Supreme Court decision, but the biggest misperception that you're like, no, this is what really happened?
Yeah, so, I mean, the biggest misperception out there is that the Supreme Court decided who got to be president. And that's not true. The voters in the election in 2000 decided to elect George W. Bush as president of the United States. That was based on the votes that were cast that were recounted and certified when it all came down to Florida. What the U.S. Supreme Court did was, in interpreting the law, basically stopped further recounts or stopped it from going further because Florida was up against the deadline to be able to certify its electors in order for them to participate in the Electoral College. So look, the misnomer that the Supreme Court 5-4 decided, we're going to elect George W. Bush is completely false. What they did was they just determined the law, and the outcome of that law had the result that it was confirmed that President Bush was elected.
What do you think the big issue will be here in this election? Like, what do you think will make it to the Supreme Court? I think
the issue here, look, in 2000, you had a complete universe of ballots that everybody was fighting over. And it's crazy that, for example, in Georgia, here yesterday and the day before, they're still finding votes that got set aside and not counted. Thousands of votes. I mean, this is 2020. How are they not able to at least capture the votes that were collected in the election? You have the issue in Michigan where there's a question about whether they can certify the ballots. And I think that the chaos that have been caused by these election administrators and the flood of expanded mail voting for areas that were not prepared to do so really calls into question the accuracy of the final vote counts. But look, our Constitution has a solution for that. Ultimately, it is the state legislatures that are empowered with the authority to choose the electors who then go participate in the Electoral College. So to your question, I think the fight may be over whether you can really certify a state's vote count given the chaos that is ensuing, that's had ensued. And the Supreme Court says, look, this is just too broken to be reliable. Then that could force the process to the state legislature for Pennsylvania or Florida or Georgia, who would have to decide how their state's going to be represented.
Yeah, and Trump needs to make that case of fraud so that the state legislatures have the cover in order to do that. Can you imagine? I mean, you were there with the freak out from the left back in 2000. Could you imagine the reaction from the left if Wisconsin and Pennsylvania legislatures picked the electors?
It's scary, and you're already seeing a hint of what that will look like here just recently with the rally in support of President Trump in Washington, D.C. I was horrified to see, women screaming in terror, running from, hooded thugs, to see children crying as they're trying to leave this peaceful rally with their parents who are being hounded by people that are screaming profanities at them and throwing water and pushing them from behind. It's terrifying, but we can't succumb to fear and threats. We've got to stand up for it. We've got to make sure that we have a election result that is, has integrity and that the American people can trust. and deal with the consequences that are going to flow from that.
Yeah, I think that's right. People have the courage to do it. Rob Henneke, General Counsel, Texas Public Policy Foundation. Rob, appreciate you. Thank you.
Hey, it's great to be with you. Thanks.
Have a great day. Thanks for your insight. Recount 2020, Bush v. Gore. We've got more coming up next. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to our special Recount 2020, Bush v. Gore. I want to go to Hans von Spakovsky. He is the Senior Legal Fellow at the Heritage Foundation who specializes in all this election law stuff. Hans, how are you, sir?
I'm doing just fine, thanks.
Great to talk to you. So maybe you can give us a little recap on Bush v. Gore, and we could start there. What was Bush v. Gore? What was the case exactly?
Well, you know, the count was the vote count was so close in Florida that Gore went to court, I think, first and wanted a recount in certain counties. The problem was, and this is why we ended up before the U.S. Supreme Court, is that when counties were doing the recount, they had different standards on what they were going to consider to be a valid vote. You know, at the time they were using punch card voting machines, which today nobody even knows what they are. But the problem was when you looked at them manually, sometimes it was hard to tell if they had been punched all the way through, and therefore there was a vote there for a particular candidate. And what the reason this ended up before the Supreme Court was because the court said, and remember, it was up there twice. I think people forget that. It was up there twice. And the first time it got up there, it was a 7-2 decision. So it was the liberals and the conservatives saying, look, wow, you have to have the same standard throughout a state as to what is considered a vote. Because of equal protection, you know, one person, one vote, you can't have one standard in one county on what's going to count as a valid vote. And then you go to a different county and they have a different standard. You have to have the same standard throughout the entire state. The reason it ended up there the second time, and that was, of course, the final time it was before the court, was because despite the U.S. Supreme Court telling Florida and all the different counties, you got to have the same standard, they didn't do it. When they were doing the recount again, they still were having different standards on what they considered would be a valid vote or not. And so the second time it went up to the court, again, this time it was the Bush people saying, look, they didn't listen to you. They still have different standards. And this time you had a 5-4 split in the decision. It wasn't that the 4 justices disagreed with that they all agreed. You have to have the same standard from county to county. The split was that the 5 conservatives said, well, look, it's too late now. You know, we're too close to the time that the Electoral College has to meet to allow Florida to try to do it right again, whereas the 4 liberal justices wanted to give Florida a second chance to try to get it right. And so that ended the case. The bottom line of the Bush v. Gore decision basically is you have to have the same standard throughout a state on what's going to be considered a valid vote.
Wow. Okay, like that's amazing, and I had no idea. All right, like that's like how that no one knows this, and we're told very different things. Okay, so I hear that, and I'm thinking of Rudy the other day, and among some other arguments that may be a little more whatever, he made one argument about, I think it was in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Right, that Pittsburgh and Philadelphia had different standards for curing ballots than maybe exactly other counties in the state have. Can you explain that for us?
Yeah, they're raising a Bush v. Gore problem because what they're saying happened is this. Under state law in Pennsylvania, there's no cure process. In other words, when a voter sends in their absentee ballot, election officials are supposed to review it and make sure that it complies with state law. So there's supposed to be a signature. There's supposed to be the voter's name and address that they have filled into the form. If any of that information is missing, or if the voter, for example, forgot to sign the ballot, under state law, the ballot is rejected. End of story. But what happened in Pennsylvania was that election officials apparently in the 2 big urban centers, Pittsburgh in Philadelphia decided to set up a cure process where they would call voters and say, look, we're going to reject your ballot unless you come in and fix it. And the problem is, folks in the rest of the state, they didn't have that opportunity because the other counties followed the law and didn't set up a cure process. You know, people may think it's a good idea from a policy standpoint to set up a cure process. Sure, and if the state legislature wanted to do that, they could. But you can't have two different standards in the same election, because what that meant was that folks in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia had a greater opportunity to vote than people in the rest of the state. And so the Trump campaign is claiming those absentee ballots that were cured should not be counted because it violates the principles laid out in the Bush v. Gore decision.
Well, that seems rock solid. That's like as close to a one-to-one as I could imagine. But the question is, so what would the court rule? Like, would the court, and are we able to say, oh, well, that's only 1,000 ballots? Or could the court take a different stance, which is we're throwing away all the absentee ballots in those counties? Or is that too extreme?
No, that's too extreme. And in fact, you've just put your thumb on the problem, okay? The proper remedy for that would be to say to Pittsburgh and to Philadelphia, you have to pull out of your count any absentee ballots that you gave folks the opportunity to cure and they came in and fixed. I have no idea whether they would be able to do that. In fact, I kind of doubt it, because remember, once the absentee ballot is separated from the information that tells you which voter sent it in, it disappears into a huge pile with all the other ballots. So I'm not sure they can pull it out to reduce the count.
So what's a court do with that?
Well, sometimes you have situations where a court says, yeah, the law was violated, but there's no remedy that will fix the problem. And that is the big legal hurdle that the Trump campaign faces in this case.
Now, we kicked off the show with a New York Times story from 1994 in Pennsylvania, and the judge threw out all the ballots, all the absentee ballots, because he said there was enough fraud in them. Now, there was only 1,700 ballots. It was a local state Senate race, but it did flip the result, and it flipped the state Senate. So there is precedent for throwing out all the ballots, but is it just that this is too many ballots to throw out? It's just too much of an ask for the court?
Yeah, it may be. I'm very familiar with that 94 case. And, you know, the difference there was that, as you said, it was a much smaller race with a much smaller margin of victory. Judges, you know, are very reluctant to overturn the results of elections, even when they've got substantial evidence that the results were compromised. So here, I think you have to convince the court, one, that you're right, and second, that there's actually a remedy that will fix the problem, and I don't know if they'll be able to do that.
Whoa. Okay, we got about 2.5 minutes. Can you give me one more kind of, maybe the best legal case you think Trump's team has other than that one?
Well, the other one also is out of Pennsylvania, because remember, the other claim that they're making, which actually I think is a strong legal argument, is that, remember, the deadline set by state law in Pennsylvania for the receipt of absentee ballots was the end of Election Day. So your absentee ballot had to be in the hands of election officials by the end of Election Day. State officials there, with the approval of the state Supreme Court, extended the deadline for the receipt of absentee ballots to 3 days past Election Day. Now, once again, if the state legislature, if they wanted to do that, they can. Because the Constitution specifically gives state legislatures, not state government, but specifically state legislatures, the power to set the rules governing federal elections in their state. And I think the argument that the Trump campaign is making is the state courts and these state officials, they didn't have the authority to basically override state law and extend the deadline to 3 days, and every absentee ballot that was received after Election Day should not be counted.
That seems rock solid legally as well. Do we have any idea what number that is again?
No, that is unclear. And also, again, it's unclear whether or not they would be even able to find those ballots. remember, the election was on Tuesday. On Friday, after the election, Justice Alito, who is responsible for that circuit and those states, issued an order telling state officials to keep those late received ballots segregated. But we don't know if they actually did that or whether it was already too late, because that was after the election.
Yeah. So that's more of that'd be more than the other case we just talked about. That seems almost like a compromised enough situation where the court could maybe throw some things out, more so than the other case you said, at least.
Yeah, no, that's true. But what I don't know is how many ballots were received after the deadline, and is it enough to change the outcome? I think the last time I looked, the margin of victory was a little over 60,000 votes in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that many were received after Election Day.
Yeah, probably not. But, you add up a couple of these things and maybe there's enough case to throw away even more. Very interesting. Okay, last question. We really got to run, Hans. But these affidavits, and we've read a bunch of them. If you're a judge and you read an affidavit, how much do you take it as gospel, or how much does a judge have discretion on it? And be like, oh, I don't really believe that guy. Or, oh, no, it's an affidavit. I must believe it as if it's true.
Well, judges have a lot of discretion to decide whether a particular witness is credible or not, and in particular, whether there's other evidence that either supports what the witness is saying or throws into doubt what the witness is saying. So it's going to be all up to the discretion of the judge. Okay,
and a lot of judges probably, right, until it gets to the Supreme Court?
Yes, because there's a lot of lawsuits going on in different states.
Okay, so you see this dragging out for a bit longer?
Yes, although everybody involved in this, including all the judges, are well aware of the deadline. And the deadline is December 14th is when the Electoral College is supposed to meet in each state at the state capitol and cast their official votes for president. And like I said, folks are well aware of that.
Very good. Hans von Spakovsky. Hans, if you'll do it, I'd love to talk again next week. We have plenty to talk about.
Sure. Happy to do it.
Thanks. I appreciate you. Hans von Spakovsky from Heritage Foundation. Wonderful. All right, we'll come back. We'll talk about the historical precedent of all of these, going back hundreds of years. Calm is not the norm. Chaos is the norm. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to our special. One thing I just think is so interesting. People today think that elections are always just peaceful and wonderful and no problem. We vote, and then there's a peaceful transfer of power, and the president gets on Marine Corps One or the Marine One and flies off, and then that's it's like no. Chaos is much more the norm than the alternative. So to give us that perspective and therefore peace, one of our resident historians, David Petrusa, is here, author of many, many books. Maybe the most relevant here is 1960, LBJ versus JFK versus Nixon, the epic campaign that forged 3 presidencies. David, how are you, sir?
Doing good, doing good.
So what do you think about that? Like, again, this idea that, everything's supposed to be calm and normal and all that. Is that the norm, or is chaos the norm?
It's supposed to be, but... everyone says, well, unprecedented. Well, we've had at least four big messes in presidential elections, going back to 1800 with when it was a tie for president between Jefferson and Aaron Burr. And if you've seen the Broadway show, or even if you haven't, even if you've taken like 8th grade civics or something, you know what happened to Alexander Hamilton because of that. That's a mess. Somebody ultimately gets shot over that, killed. And he's on the $10 bill. That's bad. 1824. There's sort of a 4-way race, which is kind of interesting because it's right after the era of good feelings. And then we have a 4-way race for the presidency, and it gets all bollocksed up in the Electoral College. No one has a majority. The vote goes to John Quincy Adams, and the Jackson people allege the corrupt bargain, okay, that Henry Clay got bought off, and that's how he got Secretary of State under Adams. So he's really cheesed off, comes roaring back in 4 years later. And I'm going to skip ahead to 2000. to Bush versus Gore in Florida. It's close in a lot of states. It's not just close in Florida. I mean, it takes a while to settle, like in New Mexico and some of the western states. But, oh, and of course, they call it. They call it before the election is over in Florida, because Florida's in 2 time zones. And the later time zone is the crazy Republican area, Joe Scarborough's district, 68% for Bush. Okay? But the polls are still open. They say, well, Gore won. He's the president. Well, no. And then when they count all the votes, Bush is ahead by over 1,000. They start counting. Now, the Florida case is very close to what the Pennsylvania case is now, okay? Because you've got a state Supreme Court making the laws, okay, or changing the law from what the legislature did. They extended the recount period in Florida. And in Pennsylvania, we know this year what they did was they extended when the votes could be counted. And that may yet to be settled. The Supreme Court ruled against the Supreme Court of the United States, ruled against the Supreme Court of Florida in that case. And also in Pennsylvania right now, you have ballots which could be cured. People who mailed their ballots could change their ballots in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, but not in the other parts of the state. And the Supreme Court said that you could, this was a violation, or the violation of the way the votes were being recounted in Florida was not due process of equal protection under the 14th Amendment. That was a 7-2 decision. So you might see, you can watch on YouTube a young fellow named Brett Kavanaugh talking about that, okay? Because he and actually 2 other members, Roberts and our newest justice, were all working in the Bush v. Gore Bush team in Florida that year. Wow. So it eventually gets settled by the Supreme Court. Now, is this election dragging out? Well, yes, it dragged out in Florida in 2000 in the Supreme Court. That wasn't decided until December 17th or 18th. But the big mess is 1876, where 3 southern states, the returns are, you get 2 sets of electors being sent in. You get a Republican set, Democratic set, and there's, okay. So now you're saying that there's an overcount now in the voting. Like, why are more people voting than there are registered voters in some areas? Yep. Okay. South Carolina vote, 100%, 101% of the voters in that state vote. And of course, as those people are Democrats generally, because that's rigged that way. So is that going to be accepted? In Oregon, one of the electors died. And then who's going to replace him? The governor says one person, the other 2 electors say somebody else. That's disputed. Whoa. Colorado gets put into the union so late in August that they don't vote for president. And the state legislature names the electors. That's the last time a state legislature has done that, okay?
Wow.
So it's not in the Constitution that people vote. I think it's something like 14,000 people voted for George Washington the first time out.
Yeah.
So yeah. All those things, all that ball of confusion in all those years, not to mention 1960, where the returns in Illinois, specifically Chicago, and in Texas, Lyndon Johnson's Texas, are highly suspect. And could Nixon have challenged that? Yes, he could have. I don't know how well he would have made it, but there was a lot of talk about that, and I certainly get questions about it every time I'm talking about that book.
Yeah, amazing. Okay, so all those stories are incredible and deserve hours of inspection. But did the people who lived through those times, were they all as hysterical as people in the media are today? Like, this is the end of the republic and we're never going to survive? Or were they calmer, do you think?
Well, Ulysses S. Grant, who was president in 1876, called out troops to guard the Capitol. So that's pretty hysterical.
Jeez, yeah.
this level of hysteria and of where things are not settled in certain states, and then you pile on and you say, no, nothing to see here, is really pretty sickening to me, really. Where everything is not, is thrown cold water on. Let's wait. As a historian, I like to wait until all the evidence is in. Okay, so let's see what the challengers say. Let's let it go to the jury. Let it go to the judge, and let if not history judge, let the due process judge.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, people in the media are all about now. And as a historian, you have a totally different mindset. Obviously, you're way more patient as you look back on.
Well, that's why I say, like 4 years ago, well, you're going to write about 2016? Hell no, I'm not going to do that, because I want to see all the material come in, and when you see a story come in, whether it's a shooting or anything like that, the first 24 hours, so much of the information is just plain wrong. Just
we're in the equivalent. Yeah, we're in the equivalent of the first 24 hours of the 2016 election still.
We really are. With the election.
Yeah.
Basically, the election hasn't happened yet, because the election is the electors. And that process could get really messy, where, say in 1876, I saw Alan Dershowitz was talking, where he said the Trump strategy might be not to get to 270, but to keep Biden from getting to 270, i.e., that the both houses of Congress have to separately verify the slate of electors. So if the Republican Senate says Michigan is phony or Pennsylvania is phony, and Biden doesn't get to 270 because those electors don't vote, then it goes to the House, where the Republicans will have 26 or 27 votes, voting as a block per state, and then bingo, all of a sudden, surprise ending, gang.
Wow. That's amazing. And that's still on the table, absolutely. My last question for you, David, just back to perspective. Like, do you, as you witness these things, as a historian, do you have peace as things are happening, just to be patient and wait things out and not jump to conclusions? Is that kind of your mindset and one you recommend other people have?
And also, having lived a fair amount of time, I've lived through a bunch of electoral disasters when things all seem to be coming to an end, and then, things flip around in 4 years, 4 years after Obama gets his second term, I think he was the first Democratic president to win majorities since Franklin Roosevelt. And then 4 years after that, Trump is president. So who knows?
Yeah, you're right. Very good. David Petruzza, and maybe we could talk another day about the era of good feelings. I've never heard of that before. But 1815 to 1825, what was that about? I doubt we're going to have it for the next 10 years, but who knows? 1960, LBJ, JFK, Nixon. Go read all of his books. David Petruzza. Thanks, David. Appreciate you.
Tnot you.
Have a wonderful day. Always good to talk to you, David. That's it. That's our special. Election 2020. Bush v. Gore. It's not over. True story. Mike Slater. Spread the word.